Thanks for clicking! Do not make the mistake of thinking that what's happening right now with the Trump tariffs are mostly about the Trump tariffs. This according to a recent post by RayDalio. Dalio, author of The Changing World Order, makes the point that while the majority of the news attention is justifiably being devoted towards these tariffs and their impact on the markets and the economies, most people are losing focus on what got Trump elected in the first place and what brought these tariffs about. Mainly a classic breakdown of the monetary, domestic, political, and international order.
What are those?
And we've touched on these topics before on this channel, between problematic U.S. debt auctions, the unsustainability of the U.S. fiscal path, and the structural changes being undertaken by the Trump administration. But Dalio's article underscores these problems, demonstrating that while we are currently focused on the problems that these tariffs are going to be creating, in reality, the tariff talk is just a manifestation of underlying shifts in the global political world order that will far outlast President Trump.
You're getting one way or the other.
So what I want to do today is go over Dalio's article, take a look at the underlying shifts occurring in the global economy that, says Dalio, are culminating in these tariffs, and then discuss some longer-term implications. As we'll see today, if these tariffs are indeed the culmination of underlying shifts occurring in the global economy, then these shifts, how this plays out, will continue to occur long after these tariffs disappear, if and when that happens. We will obviously continue to track these developments on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into Dalio's article. Onto the article. As mentioned, Dalio says that these tariffs are a symptom of a global order that is breaking down in terms of monetary, domestic, political, and geopolitical world orders. First, the breaking down of the current monetary system, which Dalio says is occurring because too much existing debt, the rates of adding to it are too fast, and existing capital markets and economies are supported by this unsustainably large debt. Yeah, and we've talked about this before on this channel. Right now, the U.S. deficit is projected to hit $1.9 trillion in 2025, with $7 trillion going out and only $5.2 trillion coming in, a 6+% deficit to GDP ratio, emergency level spending during a non-emergency. This is expected to get even worse as time goes on, with the deficit projected to hit $3 trillion in the next 4 years. And this, says Dalio, is a problem, with the U.S. taking on too much debt to finance its excesses, combined with China, which lent the U.S. too much money so it could sell the U.S. goods to support its economy. It's this system that is breaking down. So, very basically, the world order had been characterized by China growing its manufacturing base by selling its goods to the United States, which bought those goods using borrowed money from China. The U.S. exported paper, its paper currency, to China, and China exported real durable goods to the United States. And we can see all of this clear as day in the data, with the amount of money being lent to the United States by China skyrocketing over the past 25 years, with imports to the United States of real goods moving up right along with it, which obviously isn't sustainable. Eventually, China is going to want to stop importing an ever-increasing supply of U.S. dollars, and consequently, losing their purchasing power. Further, on the U.S. side, says Dalio, the U.S. lost its manufacturing and middle-class base. So we can see how this system was inevitably not going to work long-term in perpetuity. Either A, China was going to get tired of importing U.S. paper in exchange for real manufactured goods, and indeed it did, having severely scaled back their debt purchases from the U.S., or B, the U.S. was going to run out of a tax base, it was going to run out of a middle class capable of paying the interest on that debt. And we have some signs of that as well, with the number of people employed in the manufacturing base in the United States plummeting over the past 25 years, despite increases in the population. And now, says Dalio, as a result, we're seeing the president use admittedly blunt ways to change this imbalance. Whether or not these efforts will work to change these imbalances remains to be seen. But the point that Dalio is making is that these tariffs are the culmination of those imbalances that have been growing for the past quarter century. There was going to, one way or the other, be a disruption of the current system. It just happened to take the form of tariffs.
Yes, and we're grateful to them.
Next, the breakdown in the domestic political order. mainly being caused by huge gaps in education, opportunity, productivity, income, and wealth, and the inability of the current political order to address those gaps. And for this, the link between economic prosperity and an effective and responsive political class, we can go back to 1959 and Seymour Martin Lipset, who posited that the more well-to-do a nation, the greater the chances that it will sustain democracy. While governments in well-to-do, high-income nations work to organize a compromise between workers and the elite, between workers and the investment class, the shrinking of that economic pie can lead to a breakdown of that compromise, can lead to win-at-all-cost fights between left and right populists over who gets to control what's left of that pie. And yeah, we've all read the studies discussing the declining middle class that we're seeing in North America, with the upper class garnering a greater portion of that pie. And Dalio quite rightly notes that history shows that strong autocratic leaders emerge as classic democracy and classic rule of law are removed as barriers to autocratic leadership. Now, that's not at all to say that Trump is an autocrat.
You're awful!
And it's certainly not to say that Trump isn't an autocrat.
You're awful!
But rather, that is to say that as the economic pie shrinks, people's positions harden, and they're more likely to accept non-democratic processes from the left or the right, which culminate in the acceptance of certain processes, fake news, Citizens United, etc., that probably wouldn't have been acceptable 30, 40, 50 years ago when that economic pie was growing. So what Dalio is saying is that as that relative economic pie continues to shrink, due in large part to the problems we discussed earlier with the debt, we're going to see more extreme positions coming out of the United States as various groups vie for the largest share they can get of that shrinking economic pie. And finally, says Dalio, the geopolitical order that we've all come to know over the past 80 or so years, one dominated by the United States dictating to others, is over. The US is increasingly eschewing its multilateral approach, even prior to Trump, and is increasingly acting in an America First manner. And in many ways, I think this is very much a macrocosm of what we discussed a few minutes ago, with domestic political actors going to extremes to increase their overall share, their overall relative share. That's also what we're seeing on the international scale, with the United States going to more and more extremes to try to, at minimum, maintain what it sees as theirs.
It's now mine.
And make no mistake, the U.S. relative share of that pie was shrinking long before President Trump came to office. Take a look at the G7 GDP versus BRICS for the past 20 years. We can also see a gradual and sustained decline in the overall U.S. share of GDP, again, well before President Trump. So, as the U.S. power continues to wane, says Dalio, that's going to get manifested in any number of wars. Trade wars, tech wars, military, etc. So, very similar to what we saw in the domestic order, as U.S. power in the international order continues to wane, it could very well, as we're seeing, get more and more extreme in its geopolitical positioning. Now, Dalio also says that major climate changes and technological innovation will also work to shape the future global world order, but the monetary, domestic, and geopolitical changes are the major issues at hand. And Dalio says that it's these underlying 5 shifts that are going to be the big changes. These big changes that are manifesting themselves into the Trump tariff policy. And I think this is a really interesting way of framing the challenges ahead. We've talked about these before multiple times on this channel. The U.S. debt problems, the problematic U.S. auctions, structural inflation, structural debt, noting that even if these Trump tariffs went away, that we still have all these underlying issues that will come back to the forefront. Higher yields, higher borrowing costs, etc. The United States, as we talked about before, will no doubt likely continue to be a dominant player in the global world order. But its power is waning. It has growing problems that have been faced by every single empire that waned at one point or another. How those underlying shifts, those underlying processes culminated was always going to be the big question. Whether or not it was going to be a slow, transitional, peaceful decline, or if it was going to be one great big event. See Britain in the 1940s. So, while the tariff talk does have real and immediate consequences for us here in Canada, for the world over, Dalio's point that the underlying issues, if this tariff talk goes away, if all of these tariffs can be negotiated away, these underlying issues will continue to persist and will likely lead to some very unpredictable actions on behalf of the, at least for now, superpower. How this all plays out remains to be seen. Dalio obviously thinks that it will have a bad ending one way or another, but we will obviously continue to track all of these processes on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.